Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy folks, and welcome back to the kingdom. Today, OnePageRules announced a new patch to their gaming system, bringing us to version 3.2. Third edition, released back in September of 2023, had its first update just a few weeks after that, and now 4 months later we have had the release of the second major update to the gaming system. Now if you'd like, you can read the full article on the OnePageRules website. There will be a link in the description below. But here I'll go over some of the changes so that you can learn what's new while still being able to paint your minis. So you're welcome. Okay, so the first new addition addresses game balance. Now OnePageRules stated that they balance units by examining the amount of damage a unit can give and receive throughout the course of the game. Now, all OnePageRules official armies have been updated, and user-created lists will now be marked as balanced or not balanced using their what they call their BAL-VAL equation and marked in the community books as a balanced or non-balanced army. They still welcome you to play with whatever armies you want, but just know that if your custom army doesn't meet their standards, it will be marked as imbalanced because the army's a little bit OP. So we've gotten here a little peek into how OnePageRules determines when a unit is balanced or not. It's simply, can it give as good as it gets for its points? I've always been curious how they determine when a unit is worth so many points or not. We know that if you're a Patreon subscriber, you get to play around with the Army Forge and create your own specific units with all the rules and stats that you'd like. But now we get a little bit of a peek as to how they specifically determine when a unit is too strong or too weak. Now, on to the specifics. First, in terrain. The terrain section of the beginner's guide has been expanded to include additional help on how to set up a board and classify various types of terrain according to the terrain rules. For example, they suggest that you classify buildings as both blocking and impassable, rubble is just difficult, and so on and so on. They give you a list of the typical kinds of terrain that you'll run into in a game and how they would recommend classifying that terrain. As in everything else with the game, of course, you're not bound to those specific rules. You can classify terrain however you want, but for people who are new to wargaming and maybe aren't quite sure what should be classified as what, it's a nice way of getting you used to some of the basics when setting up a board and determining what terrain does what. Very useful tool for new players. For veterans, it's kind of codifying what you've already been doing. Now, there is also a second section about terrain recommendations. The basic core rules set about 10 to 15 pieces per board, per a 6x4 board, and that hasn't changed at all. And they recommend that about a quarter of the board should have terrain on it. They do now go into a little bit more detail that they recommend specific ratios for specific kinds of terrain. So for example, about 50% of the terrain, not 50% of the board, but 50% of the terrain should block line of sight, roughly a third should provide cover, a third should be difficult, so on and so forth. Now, naturally, if you're playing a specific scenario, your narrative will drive what the different pieces of terrain do. But if you're doing a pickup game, a one-off game at your friendly local gaming store, or a competitive game, this provides a little bit more of a guideline for how you should set up the board to make it so that the terrain isn't necessarily being stacked in favor of one side of the board or in favor of one player or another. The section also provides a number of suggestions on how to distribute and set up the terrain, both randomly or intentionally, to again avoid stacking the deck in favor of one player over one with another. Okay, the next big change is actually a pretty big one. Armies with regeneration. The regeneration rule itself has not changed, it's staying in the book, but now armies like the Robot Legions, which used to have regeneration as an army-wide special rule, now have a new rule that's a little bit different. This new army-specific rule, at least in the case of the Robot Legions, is now called Self-Repair, and it ignores wounds on a 6+ instead of a 5+. But this new 6+ rule is not affected by poison or by rendering, so it's 6+ across the board all the time. Regeneration is a 5+, but can be negated by poison, by rending, and so on. Now, these units that have had regeneration effectively removed and replaced with something else, they could potentially have regeneration added on as a spell or with an item or piece of war gear that adds that extra rule. Now, on top of that, for the Robot Legion, several of their units have had their quality and defense changed as well, in many cases reduced. So, my Metal Boys done got nerfed.
That's gotta hurt.
Ghostly Undead are another unit, or another army I should say, that are going to be affected by this change the most. Vampiric Undead have not been given any army-wide rule that gives them this 6+ ignore rule, so I was a little sad about that. I was kind of hoping they would be, but they're not going entirely begging. So the Vampiric Undead have now been given a few changes to help them out a little bit. So there's now a new hero specifically for werewolves, and upgrades have been separated and customized for skeleton heroes, drained heroes, so on and so forth, instead of just having one pool of upgrades and resources that are applicable to all different kinds of heroes. So a little more diversity there. A tiny change to war fleets. Some armies and fleets have had the names changed just to align a little better with the lore. Nothing has changed, however, in the way of stats or rules for those particular units. Now, there are also some other interesting changes to general or game-wide rules. In skirmish games, units that fail a routing test but aren't stunned now become stunned instead of routing. So this means you're not going to see a game entirely end during the morale phase just because a player fails enough route tests to basically remove their entire army. So in theory, that's a pretty big change, because it means that units will still be on the board, still be in play, and the game continues on even though those units are stunned. Most likely, however, it's not going to be a radical change. It will add maybe one more turn to the game because those stunned units can't do anything on their activation and their opponent can easily knock them out, and then you really do have the entire unit removed from a single game of play. But we'll have to see after playing a few games how this rule actually works out on the battle boards once we get to actually rolling some dice. So what this change might do is slow the cascade of routing early in the game, and any of you who have seen the Ninja Turtles versus Prime Brothers battle, I was tabled in turn 1 because of this. But the thing is, the fact that I had to take those tests, which led to me getting tabled in turn 1, means that basically what will happen is I'll just get beaten turn 2. So we'll see. Okay, on to the next change. Casters can only cast spells from their own faction. Now, I always took that as a given. Army Forge was pretty clear because once you added a caster to your army, your specific army spells then populated in your army list. But apparently they had enough of a problem with it that they've had to codify it. Now, I may get some pushback from this, and some people might not like this, but this is the kind of competitive loophole crap that I think starts to ruin a game.
See? You ruin everything.
So some people might not like that, but this is what has made like the 40k competitive scene a little bit toxic, is one of those, well, the rules don't specifically say I can't do that. Well, now they do. Next item. A new special rule has been added called Limited, which means that that particular weapon has one use per game. So keep an eye out on your weapon profiles to see if any of your weapons have gone from being useful every single round to now one shot. Next big change is involving Impact. Impact is now officially declared as not an attack. It's more like an ability. So there's a lot of implications there depending on the situation of how you're using it, but it is not officially an attack. So you could, for example, charge a unit in that has a caster in it, settle your impact hits, and then cast a spell, because according to the casting rules, casting has to be done before any attacking is done. Impact does not count as an attack. However, at the same time, they've added a rule that impact cannot be used if a unit is fatigued. Now that's a fairly significant change, because it gives a big incentive to charge a unit with impact and then force the player to make an interesting decision. Do they want to fight back against a unit that they can probably wipe out, but then they'll lose their impact? However, in order to retain impact, that opponent would have to choose not to fight back, and then there's the chance they might risk failing morale and get stunned or even worse routed in melee. So they've made impact now a very interesting kind of special rule. You got to be careful when to use it, and you want to position your units carefully so that you don't get it stolen from you by your opponent when they come charging in. So interesting rule change there. Next big change, poison and rending now fully negate regeneration, not just reduce it. So with the nerf to those armies that had regen, and with this new rule about poison and rending, armies like robot legions and ghostly undead will have to take a long look at how they're built and how they're used. The army-wide rule about ignoring wounds is now more of a clutch rule rather than a core one. You can't build your army expecting it to survive a long time based on its regeneration. Instead, now it's in that crucial moment, key moment, that's when you're going to get your save. So those of you who play any of those armies, you're probably going to have to rebuild your list or at least rethink your strategies. Another change, it's small but still significant. The range for both the Entrench special rule and the Stealth special rule has been reduced from 12 to 9. But that means the rule has just got better. So a unit that was 12 inches away previously could now ignore your Stealth rule. Now they got to get in even closer. So that is an improvement for those specific units. Another big change has to do with spell casting. Debuff spells have been given an extra 6 inches to range. So this stretches some of your spells to 12 inches and other spells as much as 18 inches. So casters now have more options earlier in the game. Previously, I found that for the first round or two, all my casters could ever do was spells that buffed my own units, and the buffs usually were only good in melee or they weren't that useful until we got in combat, and by the time you got in combat, you're going to be shifting to mostly your direct damage spells. So now casters are going to be a little more dangerous at a distance and have a little bit more options once the enemy gets in range. So look for that to make casting now a little bit more tactical on how you decide what spells to use and when to use them. The last change is for those of you who play regiments. The counter special rule has been changed. Previously, if you charged a unit with the counter special rule, you lost your impact rule. That has been changed. Now, counter only reduces impact by 1 instead of negating it entirely. And I think lore-wise, that's a pretty good change, or fluff-wise, that's a good change. According to the old rule, a single goblin with a pointy stick could negate the impact charge of a giant block of cavalry, just as well as it could negate the impact bonus of a single halfling riding on a chicken. Now, it will reduce the impact of that single halfling riding on a chicken to nothing, which makes sense, but that massive block of cavalry is just going to suffer a very slight decrease in impact and is still going to run over that goblin with the pointy stick roughshod. So I think on paper it looks pretty good. Of course, first time I play a game where it actually affects me, I'm going to say it's a stupid rule, because, that's just how I roll. Alright folks, so that's the meta view of the changes. Now there are a whole lot of remaining changes, but they're specific to changes and tweaks on individual armies. And they're presented in a very clear bullet point format on the OnePageRules main page. So rather than just read you a laundry list of changes, check out those changes, see how your army has changed. The Army Forge builder has also been updated, so you might want to log back in and see how your old army lists may have been adjusted with the new rules. For example, one of my dwarf armies is now 5 points more expensive for the exact same lists, and one of my Chivalrous Kingdoms lists is now 30 points more expensive. So I'm going to have to do some trimming to get back to the points values that I normally play. So, for everybody else, with changes in rules, changes in point values, changes in how special rules work with some of your units, perhaps it's time to start a new list, try a new strategy, maybe remove some units and replace them with new ones. I don't know. Take a look. Tell me what you think. What changes did you have to make to your armies, or were you lucky enough that everything still worked out exactly the same? So, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Remember, keep your dice on the table, and it may not be perfect, but I'm sure it's good enough.